How my dad didn't go to Vietnam. In 1969, my dad graduated from Rice University with a 5-year master's in chemical engineering. Edit. Since so many commenters seem to think he was some kind of rich kid. His parents both taught public school, and he went to college on a full academic scholarship. The Vietnam War was raging, and although he and his classmates had all received deferments during their studies, their deferments were over and it was time for them to go before the draft board. Most of his classmates weren't worried, because they were slated to see the Houston draft board, which had a reputation for handing out continued deferments like Halloween candy. However, my dad is from Oklahoma, which meant that he had to be evaluated by the Tulsa draft board, which was much stricter. Dad had applied to the chemical engineering PhD program at Stanford, and had been accepted with a full stipend. He was excited to go, but first he had to get past the draft board. The Stanford faculty wrote a letter to the Tulsa draft board, explaining that Mr. Hammer would be embarking on a research program that would greatly benefit the war effort and asking for another deferment. The Tulsa draft board wrote back in short order. Mr. Hammer had already benefited from the only deferment he was going to get, and thus he was to present himself to the Army Physical Examination Center post-haste. Dad was sad to lose his shot at a PhD, but not too sad, because now he could marry my mom. He'd also had several job offers already, so he accepted an offer from Exxon and he and my mom got married. His superiors at Exxon wrote another letter to the Tulsa draft board, explaining that Mr. Hammer was now gainfully employed in the oil and gas industry, where he would be conducting engineering research that would greatly benefit the war effort, and asking for another deferment. Just as quickly, the Tulsa draft board wrote back, reiterating that Mr. Hammer was not going to receive another deferment, and that if he didn't hurry up and get his Army physical, they might have to get the law involved. Disappointed, my dad went to his Army physical as scheduled. He's always been a healthy guy, and he performed just fine on most of the examinations. Up until the very end, when they measured his heart rate, it was over 100 beats per minute. "Well, we can't pass you with that," said the Army doctors. "But you're probably just nervous. Come back in 2 weeks and we'll give you another physical." "Nervous?" said my dad to himself. "I can work with that." For the next 2 weeks, my dad spent every spare moment basically teaching himself the opposite of meditation. He'd close his eyes and think of the most horrifying mental images he could, trying to drive his heart rate as high as possible. Finally, the day of the physical arrived, and things went much as before. He passed nearly everything with flying colors. But when the time came to measure his heart rate, once again it was well over 100. The Army doctors promptly diagnosed him with tachycardia, scored his physical 4F, and sent him home. He's in his 70s now, and apart from his mysteriously high heart rate, which I inherited, he's always been in great cardiac health and still is. Back in another lifetime I was in the AF stationed in Florida. What do? You learn to scuba dive. I was at a dive shop in Destin, Florida getting my tank refilled. The guy handling was 20-something, buff, appeared to be in the picture of health. It was odd he was here and not in Vietnam. Curious, I asked him why and he giggled. "Look at my feet." I did. He had to be 6 feet. And I was a 5 feet 2 inches woman, and his feet were the same size as mine. Then he explained he passed the draft physical easily until the doctor saw his feet. 4F. It didn't hinder him in his diving career whatsoever. He was a NAUI instructor. My father-in-law went to the psych evaluation, and when the evaluator stepped out, he completely rearranged his desk in order to improve efficiency. And the guy came back and said you failed. Get out. Is tachycardia that bad? I'm bradycardic, so even though I'm not fit by any measure, my resting heart rate is in the low 40s. I assume this will allow me to live forever. My grandfather had a similar experience with the draft board, except he survived polio. And 2 weeks before had surgery on his lower body. So when he showed up, before the law was involved, he was in a cast, arm crutches, and my 5 feet grandmother toting 2 children behind him to help open doors. Lol. My dad did something like this. Showed up after a 4-day LSD binge. No idea why he didn't pass the psych evaluation. My dad said they heard a wheeze in his chest and said come back in 6 months, so for all that time he smoked 4 packs of unfiltered Pall Malls a day. When he came back the wheeze was worse and he got 4F. My dad had a similar experience in Chicago. His blood pressure was so high they assumed he was taking something to fail the physical. He was simply nervous and had an immediate jump in BP. They locked him up for 4 days and checked his BP each day. After day 4 they let him go and he started taking meds to control his BP better. I have the same issue. No problems with my BP, but in suddenly intense situations it jumps quickly. A standard response, but ours is just exaggerated. Lol reminds me of the urban legend from my area. A week or 2 before the Army Phys-Cal exam, these 2 guys decide they want to be exempted from the Army service. So a week or so before the physical, they embark on a diet of Coca-Cola, as in 5 liters per day. The only food they had was the occasional MCD or similar junk. On the day of the physical you're supposed to show up super early without having eaten anything. Of course they down the largest cola bottle each right around the corner from the recruitment center. As the legend goes, they did well on the fitness levels. But when the results of the urine and/or blood test came out, they were deemed as unfit and got referred to a doctor to check for diabetes. Not a doctor myself, so not sure how true this is, but the story is 30+ years old. Grin. I knew someone who shot off their trigger finger to escape the draft. I know a guy who got his BS in Che and was drafted. He thought he might get something other than combat duty BC of his education. Nope. They out him in the airborne. I got out of military service by getting a doctor's note stating I wet the bed at night. They sent me to get checked in the Army hospital, but they couldn't really check for much. I was fully prepared to pee myself if I had to. But it never came to that. My dad got out of going to Vietnam by learning German. He got sent to assist occupying Germany instead of fighting guerrilla soldiers. My dad went to work at the auto factory right when he got out of high school. And when his draft number came up, he went in, ready to do his duty. Turned out that he had caught his hand in a machine some weeks before and couldn't bend his first finger. The doctors said it might pass off with time. Or it might not. No one knew. So the Army didn't want him. It took about 9 months of him working at it diligently, but it did finally pass off, and by the time I can remember, my dad had a fully functional right hand. A guy the first worked with told me the story of how he got out of the draft. He and his bestie had to go to MEPS the same day. He brushed his very long hair over his face and sat picking at his nails and glancing furtively back and forth, mumbling to himself. He got out on a psych waiver. His bestie took a different approach. He dosed himself with LSD and started tripping in the processing center. Unfortunately, he did not get a waiver and left immediately for Camp Pendleton, which means he was still tripping when he reported for Marine basic training. Talk about a bad trip. My dad was drafted in '72. He was diagnosed with flat feet. It wasn't enough to keep him from being drafted, but it was enough to get him a stateside assignment. There were a lot of guys having trouble with jungle rot in Vietnam. Basically, your feet get wet, never dry out, and, yeah, not pretty. They had found those with flat feet had it way worse. Interesting how your dad clearly had such a bright mind with a very skilled degree and yet was still needed to catch bullets. Surely someone would have thought a chemical engineer would be better off on the home front? My dad had very flat feet as a kid. His parents took him to an orthopedist who recommended physical therapy. So for a couple of years while he watched TV, he picked up marbles with his toes and transferred them between buckets that way. It worked and he had pretty healthy feet. When he dropped out of college, he knew his number could get called any moment. He went to the public pool and every day got on the low diving board and jumped down onto the concrete repeatedly to flatten his feet. It worked. And the war ended before his number got called. He wore cowboy boots almost constantly and swore that kept his feet from hurting. As a result of the childhood PT, he had crazy strong toes that he could pinch hard with. One of my cousins wouldn't walk into a room he was in if he was barefoot. Glad for your dad. I was in high school when the Vietnam War began. When friends returned from their tours, each one said the same thing to me. If you can stay out of this war, fucking do everything in your power to do so. I went for my physical and sat and watched as the 3 or 4 docs examined each guy. One doctor was especially painstaking while the others were 1, 2, 3. When that one doc was open, I jumped my place to him. The doc said it's okay to the sergeant standing there who wanted me to sit down. Even though I had played college football a week or 2 later, I received my 4F. The war was so unpolar that a few years later my brother got a 4F without going to a physical. I knew a vet who told me that he spent his time training for this. And then that, followed by something else, etc. He'd figured out that he wouldn't be sent to combat if he was going through a training program. So he made sure he was signed up for specialized classes for his entire 4 years. Apparently, he'd implied that he was going to make it a career. So the leadership happily kept him out of the combat. For the time being. He noped out ASAP. Can you get this story translated into Russian?
If you enjoyed this video, please check out our playlists full of similar content. Epic is like doom scrolling for your ears. Please like, share, and subscribe.